What's up YouTube, I'm Guy. Today on the channel we're going to be checking out and comparing a couple of amazing watches. Both of them are Rolex GMT Master II wristwatches. One is the BLRO or the Pepsi, the other is the BLNR or the Batman. Now before we get into anything else, I have to thank the people that helped make this possible. First of all, a viewer and friend of the channel loaned me his BLNR Batman. Big thanks to you, buddy. I appreciate it. I couldn't have done it without you. And number two, my friends over at Exquisite Timepieces loaned me the Pepsi. So a big thanks to the folks over at Exquisite Timepieces. They're an authorized dealer of over 50 different watch brands in my area. Now they're not an AD for Rolex, but they do have a very extensive pre-owned inventory, and this BLRO Pepsi came from their pre-owned inventory. I believe their asking price of $18,500. If you're looking for a Pepsi Rolex GMT Master II, go ahead and give the guys over at Exquisite Timepieces a call and talk to them about this watch. It is, at least as of today, still available. So thanks again, Exquisite Timepieces, and everyone over there. I really appreciate your help in making this possible. I'll have links down at their website, which is exquisitetimepieces.com, in the description of this video. Definitely go check them out. Well, what do we have here? Of course, you guys already know. We have a couple of Rolex GMT Master IIs. In the middle, the 1267110 BLRO, the GMT Master II Pepsi. On the right, the 116710 BLNR, otherwise known as the Batman. And of course, on the left, we have my Submariner, reference 116610LN. Why the Submariner? Well, a viewer and friend of the channel asked me, because he had a Submariner and sold it a little while ago, how does the Submariner's case size and shape and fit on the wrist compare to the case of the GMT Master IIs? So I told him I'd do some comparisons so he would know, and I thought it might be useful for the rest of you guys as well. But we'll go ahead and we'll do that much later. First, we're going to be talking specifically about these two GMT Master II watches. So I posted a picture on most of my social media accounts yesterday at some point, kind of teasing this video, showing everybody that I had these two watches, and I kind of wanted to do a little fishing and find out, what did people prefer? Were more people on Team Pepsi or were more people on Team Batman? And just based on all of the comments from all of the different social media sources, I wasn't sure. It seemed pretty close. So then I went and put a poll in my YouTube community section, and I just, wanted a simple, click on which one you liked better kind of response with some actual hard numbers. And my instincts were correct. It is pretty close. People are very mixed on these two watches. Or not mixed, I guess I should say, but split. After about 24 hours, the voting results, something on the order of about 300 votes so far, which I think is significantly decent enough to get a good sample size. 55% favor the Batman, 45% favor the Pepsi, was the results that I was seeing in the poll that I had created. Now, I think that poll jumped around up and down, maybe as close to 60-40 in favor of the Batman, but as the number of people got in and placed their votes, it started to come back closer to 50-50. And like I said, finished up, when I last looked at it, at about 55-45 in favor of the Batman. Now, I was a little bit surprised when I saw those results, to be honest. I thought it was going to be overwhelmingly in favor of the Pepsi, just because of how difficult they are to find, how quote-unquote limited or in short supply these watches are. And don't get me wrong, both of these watches are a little difficult to find right now. But if you go to an authorized dealer, you might get lucky within a few months and get a Batman, whereas it might be a year or more before you get a Pepsi. I thought based on that demand that more people were going to say they liked the Pepsi than the Batman. But no, as a matter of fact, more people like the Batman. That was pretty surprising. Now, availability on these two watches, definitely a topic that we're going to talk about. But before we get into that, Let's just go over the basic differences between these two watches, and just by looking at them here, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? There is one difference that's not quite so obvious at a glance, and we'll go over that of course being the movements. On the left, the newer watch, the BLRO, or the Pepsi, uses a newer movement, the 3285. Big difference between that movement and the movement in this Batman, which is the 3186, is the power reserve. 70 hours of power reserve on the Pepsi versus 48 hours of power reserve on the Batman. There's some new technology in this new movement on the Pepsi as well. It's got over 10 patents. It uses an entirely new barrel, gear train, and the chronology escapement, which they claim is something on the order of 15% more efficient, if I'm not mistaken. All of those things together do yield that 70-hour power reserve. And for a lot of people, that's going to be, I guess, a nice bonus. But for the most part, I think the real reason that people are drawn to this watch are the visual cues or differences between the two models. The movements notwithstanding, what are the big differences here? Well, obviously bezel color, the Pepsi, the one on the left here, red and blue. The Batman, the watch on the right, blue and black. To go along with those colors of the bezel, the GMT 24-hour hand is colored red in the case of the Pepsi and blue in the case of the Batman. I'll bring these both up closer to the camera so you can get a nice good look at the bezel and that GMT hand in red in this case. The blue on this bezel and the red on this bezel, the coloration is a point of contention for a lot of people. We'll certainly talk about that. I'll tell you what I think about the colors on this bezel, but I do want to just give you some close-ups of the differences between the bezels and the hands on these two watches. Again, blue and black here, and the GMT hand, a shade of blue as well. Overall, though, the bezels on both of these are just fabulous. I'll just start with that. The second major difference between these watches, obviously, the bracelet. On the Pepsi, a Jubilee bracelet. On the Batman, an Oyster bracelet with high polished center links. They both have more or less the same clasp. Try to turn the watches around here. Virtually the same Oyster locking clasp with easy link extensions. We'll take a quicker look at those in a little bit as well. But yeah, overall differences, that's more or less it. There might be some little minor differences. As a matter of fact, there is one supposed minor difference that I do want to touch on. I say supposed because frankly, I don't see it. But Rolex has even said that they reprofiled the case, in particular the lug profile on the case of the new Pepsi. When this was announced at Baselworld 2018, that is what they said. Now, if I look at these two watches, and I'll zoom the camera in here closer to give you a better look at the lugs, I personally see no difference in the lugs at all. When I did a review on the Pepsi a while back, I said as much back then as well. I just don't see a difference in the lugs on these two watches. And people argued with me, oh, they're different. Rolex said they're different. I mean, sure, they probably are different. If I got out like a highly precise measuring tool, maybe they would come up with, fractions of a millimeter in difference. But visually, practically, in person, for all intents and purposes, no difference at all. I'll go ahead and zoom the camera in, though, let you guys see it even closer. All right, hopefully I'm not too shaky, but there, we are zoomed in and focused on the left, the Pepsi's lugs. On the right, the Batman's lugs. From the top-down profile, does the Pepsi's look thinner? Not to my eye, and I know people are going to comment and say, oh, I think it does. And there's probably going to be people that agree with me and say, I don't think there's any difference at all. To my eye, certainly in person, even zoomed in here looking through the viewfinder, the lug profile looks identical. Let's take a look from the side, though. Alright, so here we have both watches, Pepsi on the left, Batman on the right. The case maybe looks a little bit different on the watch on the left, on the Pepsi. Maybe just a hair thinner in the mid case. Maybe that's what they were talking about when they said the lugs were profiled differently. Not the width of the lugs from that top-down view, but maybe the height of the lugs and the whole mid case for that matter from this perspective. If there is a difference, I might just be imagining it. I can barely tell if there is a difference. But there you go. There's some very zoomed in close-up looks at the lug profiles of both of these watches. Let's just say, for all practical purposes, they're pretty much identical. So there you have it. That's more or less the differences of these two watches. They're brothers or brother and sister, or however you want to look at it. Now let's get into the I don't know, the opinions or the critiques of these watches purely stylistically. Again, I'm not going to really go into too much of a difference, with the technical stuff. They're all basically the same, but stylistically, let's critique these two watches. First, let's start with the Batman. Set the Pepsi down, slide it aside here. Now, the Batman, what do I like about it? What do I dislike about it? Well, I think that the bezel is awesome. Blue and black looks fantastic. That blue GMT hand, also nice. Of course, the date complication on all the GMT watches, some people are going to dislike that because they don't like the Rolex Cyclops magnifier. I have no problem with that. Really, the only thing that probably I'm not in love with on this watch is the bracelet, and in particular, the polished center links. They are scratch magnets, smudge magnets, overall magnets of all things bad. I'll zoom in a little bit closer here, and you can see the wear and tear that the viewer that loaned me this watch has sustained on it already, and I don't think this watch is even close to a year old yet. As we come down and look at the center links on this bracelet, they're actually not too bad. Some very minor scuffing. Now it's when we get down to the clasp section that we start seeing a lot of the scrapes and scuffs. It just shows up a lot more than on, for example, my Submariner, which is all of a brushed finish. Now that is a problem for me because I like my watches looking nice and mint and clean, basically, for as long as humanly possible. And that is just a super big challenge with these polished center links. Another issue is just, stylistically, I don't prefer the flashy blinginess of the polished center links nearly as much as a fully brushed finish. Now, what about the Pepsi? Well, the bezel, that's going to be the first thing we'll touch on here. How do I like the colors of the bezel? Frankly, I love the colors of the bezel on this watch. I have been admiring it now for, what have I had it for? 2 days, I guess, wearing it around a little bit. It looks different in different lighting, and I should also point out that on the Batman, I get a little bit of that same effect. On the Batman, the blue, which looks very bright and crisp in this current lighting setup that I'm using, but it can look basically black in low light. You don't even know that it's a blue bezel. It's just black on black in certain lightings. Now the Pepsi doesn't really have that going for it. Even the blue in dim light still looks like a shade of blue. But as people have, I'm sure you've read online, they voiced the concern that the blue looks purple and that the red looks pink. And to a degree, that does happen. I find that to be the case when you're under very yellow lighting. Nice crisp white light or outdoors in natural sunlight. I think the colors on this watch are fantastic. But in particular, if you're under a more yellow shade or tint light, those colors do kind of get muted and muddy. I think that they look perfect in this lighting, though. Is the blue, a bright blue like the old aluminum bezel watches, the old GMT watches? No, it's not the same color blue, but I think it's a great looking blue as it is. I do like it quite a bit. Now, even bigger of a difference, the bracelet, the Jubilee bracelet. I absolutely love this Jubilee bracelet. Now, the center links of the Jubilee are high polished and the edges are brushed, but it's not as glitzy, shiny, obnoxious of a polishing. It's more subtle. The bracelet style is maybe a little bit more flashy or showy, but the glare that you get off of the actual polished surfaces of the bracelet are not nearly as bad as they are on the big, large polished center links of the Batman. The clasp has got a polished center just like the Batman, and it's equally a problem. You can see on this example here, there is some scratches on that center polished strip of the Oyster clasp. Again, there's just nothing you can do about it. But These polished portions of the center Jubilee 3 center links, not really an issue for me at all. I'll say that between these two watches on the wrist, what is more comfortable? That's probably a really important topic. The Oyster bracelet or the Jubilee. I find the Jubilee bracelet to be infinitely more comfortable. It wears beautifully on the wrist. I think it wears a little bit smaller as well, maybe in part because the Oyster center links extend so far. And on the Jubilee, the center links, which is, it's kind of like a straight across, almost in line with the lugs, just a little bit of an extension. But it drapes, straight down so nicely that the entire presentation, the wrist presence, it does feel a little bit more compact. Now, people are probably going to chime in and say, that's because the Lug Profiles difference. Again, we touched on that. I don't think that there's any significant difference in the Lug Profile, certainly not noticeable. To me, I don't believe that has anything to do with how it wears on the wrist. I think it is entirely to do with how the bracelet wears on the wrist. And it just wears more comfortably. It wears a little bit more smaller. It's a smaller presentation. Yeah, it's a little bit more dressy or showy because Jubilee bracelets kind of are, but I love it. Personally, for me, the Jubilee is preferable to this particular Oyster bracelet. Now, I had mentioned earlier I wanted to talk about availability because, I'm reviewing or comparing and contrasting two watches here that both of which you really can't get readily. It's such a huge problem. First world problem anyway, not a real problem. Nevertheless, though, it's obnoxious. It's annoying that if I wanted to buy either one of these watches, I'm probably SOL. I'm probably not going to walk into the store tomorrow and have a chance to get either of them. Now, here's some interesting news, I'll use that term loosely, that I wanted to share with you. Of course, this watch is on loan from my friends at Exquisite Timepieces. They're not an authorized dealer of Rolex watches, but they do get pre-owned inventory in regularly, and this came from Exquisite Timepieces pre-owned inventory. When I was down there looking at watches, and I noticed this in the case and asked if I could do a video on it, the conversation of how many of these have you seen come through the store came up. And I was told that they get the new Pepsi watches routinely, regularly, like all the time, as a matter of fact. So it's like people are going to the authorized dealer down the street, literally like a couple blocks away, buying it and driving straight to their store and selling it. And that's crazy. If these watches are supposedly so hard to find, how are they getting them on, nearly a weekly basis? It's insane to me. The availability shortage, I guess is what people call it. Is it a myth? I'm starting to think that it is a myth. I don't think that these watches are unavailable. I think that the demand for them is very high. Absolutely, a lot of people want them. Unfortunately, a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, if I had to speculate, want them just so they can immediately flip them. Go buy this watch for $9,200, take it over to a reseller and sell it for $14,000, and then they go ahead and they sell it for $18,000. Everybody makes $4 or $5 grand, everybody's happy. Except you and me, the people that legitimately want these to enjoy them for the reason that we're supposed to enjoy them, because, they're wristwatches to be worn. We're not happy, but everybody else involved is. Rolex is certainly thrilled. They can sell as many as they want, as fast as they can produce them. It is disappointing. I was a little shocked when I heard that they get so many of these watches in from end users, people just going and buying them at retail and flipping them directly. Very disappointing to hear that. And there's nothing I can do about it. Oh well, I guess. But I just wanted to share that story, talking about availability. These watches, they're not available. But why? It's not, I don't think, because of the conspiracy theory shortage. It's just that the demand is exceeding the supply, and it's being driven by greedy people that, want to flip them. I guess, hey, that's capitalism, right? So I'm all for capitalism, and that's how it works. What can you do? Let's go ahead and throw the Pepsi on my wrist, 6 3/4 inches, and kind of take a look at how it wears. Alright, here it is again, 6 3/4 inches on my wrist. I just absolutely love how this watch wears, how it feels on my wrist. It's perfect. Now, I've long since said that my Submariner is the most comfortable watch that I own, and while I guess that's still true because I don't own this Pepsi, I think I might prefer wearing this Pepsi. I haven't had it for nearly as long. I've had the Submariner for well over a year, so it's a little preemptive for me to say that I prefer the Pepsi, but it would certainly put up a big fight as far as which got my wrist time if I did own it, if it were a part of my collection. Now this is thinner than the Submariner a little bit, or maybe not necessarily thinner, but flatter, and I'll show you comparatively to the Submariner. The case back is a little bit lower profile. It feels so good. I think it looks great. I think because as I had mentioned, we don't have those long extended center horns on the end links. It just wears a little bit smaller, and if you follow my channel, you know that I kind of prefer smaller watches. It really is absolutely perfect for me. Here we have the Batman BLNR on my wrist. By extension, I don't like the feel on the wrist as much. The bracelet, I mean, it's an oyster bracelet, but you know what it's lacking is the glide lock. I can't dial the fit of this bracelet in like I can dial in the fit on my Submariner. And I just never feel when the Pepsi is on my wrist like I need that much tweakability of that bracelet. It just seems to fit me perfectly the way it just wears on the wrist. Whereas this one, maybe it's psychological, I don't know, maybe just knowing that I don't have the flexibility of the oyster bracelet like I do on my Submariner. Maybe that's what it is. I mean, it's not bad, it fits me fine. If we get under here, like that's one way I test my fit. I can get a finger right there. Yeah, it fits me fine, but it just doesn't feel quite as comfortable. Certainly heavier than the Jubilee combo bracelet and a watch on the Pepsi. Not that the weight is ever an issue on a watch. It's not like I got a 12-pound thing around my wrist. It's just difficult for me to, after having had the BLRO, the Pepsi for a while now, and wearing them back and forth a little bit, it's a little difficult for me to get excited about this watch because I am so incredibly excited about the other one. This watch is a beautiful watch, don't get me wrong. Fabulous, it's outstanding. I really do like it a lot. If I had to pick between the two of them, if I was buying them with my own money though, it would be hands down the Pepsi, without question. Now this is kind of a cool idea. What if you wanted the Batman, but you also wanted that Jubilee look? Well, my buddy that loaned me his Batman did in fact have that same thought. And what did he do? He bought a Jubilee bracelet. This one would be for a Datejust, obviously. It has the hidden clasp system. The end links are obviously different than the end links style of the Jubilee on the Pepsi. What am I trying to say? But you can get a really nice look with an official Rolex Jubilee bracelet. Super Jubilee, I think they call them. The hidden clasp system is cool. You just kind of put your finger underneath that little crown. That pops open a little latch, and there's your swing arm. So if you want to spend, and I think this bracelet is very expensive, I want to say $1,200 or $1,500, something in that ballpark. If you want to spend that kind of money to have an additional bracelet, it's certainly an option. And I've tried it on this bracelet. Not quite as cool as the one that comes on the Pepsi, because you get the nice folding clasp with a little bit of micro adjust inside the clasp and the Easy Link extension, which I don't honestly like the Easy Link. But you still get 99% of the versatility of the Jubilee bracelet. And you could have it on your Batman. So that's what, again, my buddy did. And I just wanted to share that with you. That's a potential option, something that you can do. Now, before we get into the Submariner comparison between these two watches, let's talk about alternatives for a second. How could you scratch an itch for either of these watches at a very affordable price point? Because I know a lot of people, they can't afford these watches. Well, first things first, you can scratch a Pepsi itch. Here is the Seiko SKX 009, the Pepsi SKX on a Jubilee bracelet. It's how it comes stock. If you wanted to scratch the Pepsi itch, could you do it with the Seiko? Yeah, probably. I mean, they wear totally different. The Seiko is kind of bulky and thick. The presentation of the red and blue is significantly different. Bring it in here a little bit closer. People complain about the coloration of the Pepsi colors on the Rolex. I mean, this blue on the SKX, and this is a beloved watch. Of course, it's $200, but nevertheless, a beloved watch by myself and probably millions of other people. The colors on this bezel are not nearly as nice as the colors on the Rolex. I do want to make that clear. That's my opinion. Still a very cool watch, 200 bucks, you can't beat it. And it does scratch that Pepsi itch. It doesn't scratch the Rolex itch. You're not getting anything close to Rolex quality with a Seiko SKX, but if you just want that kind of Pepsi red and blue itch scratched for you, you know, it's an option. There's a lot of other options out there. Steinhardt has a Pepsi watch that's probably a much better alternative, but it's a little bit more money. I think they're $500 or $600. I don't think I would probably buy one of those, but I have reviewed some Steinhardts and they're decent watches. Nevertheless, when I do want to kind of scratch that Pepsi itch, I throw on my SKX and it does the job. I did want to point out though just how different the coloration is. The red on the SKX and the blue versus the red and blue on the Rolex. Very dark on the Seiko. Much more bright and vibrant on the Rolex, as you can see here. Ceramic is glossy, shiny, reflective, so I think that would be to be expected, I guess is the words I'm looking for. But nevertheless, there's some options for you. But what if you want to scratch the Batman itch? How do you go about doing that? Well, my buddy that loaned me this Rolex tried to scratch the Batman itch with this Parnis. This is his watch as well. He brought it over to show me the differences between a $20 Parnis versus the GMT Rolex GMT. Very similar looking. Like, you're for sure getting an homage watch. If you're on a budget, if you don't really care that you have a Rolex or don't have a Rolex, you just kind of want this blue and black bezel oyster style case and bracelet look, I mean, that's an option for you. It's got a decent magnification over the date, although our GMT hand is sort of obscuring the view a little bit, but I'm impressed with the magnifier. Some watches, like the Steinhardt watches, the magnifier is downright awful. This one isn't bad. The ceramic, again, $120, you're getting a ceramic bezel. The insert's decent. It's engraved. You can feel the depth of the numerals there. Numerals are very similar on both of them. Colors, I don't know, the Parnis might be a little bit brighter, a little bit more vibrant even than the Rolexes. It doesn't have quite the same color blue, but the blacks are basically the same. So there's, a sub $200 option for scratching the GMT Batman itch if you're on a super budget and you're kind of trying to think of a way to get this same sort of, feel on your wrist. Something to think about, I guess. So yeah, there's tons of homage watches and alternatives and things out there that you could get in order to fill the void of not being able to buy these watches. Because let's be frank, if you go into the store and say, I want the Batman, you're probably waiting a couple of months, maybe longer. If you go into the store and say you're wanting the Pepsi, you might be waiting a year or longer, unless you're a really good customer. And unfortunately, I'm not that good of a customer. So those are, my alternatives is like, if I need something, what do I need? That's a bit of an overstatement. But if I really want a Pepsi, what do? Well, I have my Seiko SKX, and I throw that on from time to time and try to fulfill the void in my life that is the lack of a Pepsi watch. It helps, but it's not quite the same. I'm going to take a look now at the Pepsi GMT Master II, comparing it a little bit to the Rolex Submariner. Now, a buddy of mine, a friend of the channel, somebody that has loaned me a lot of watches, asked me because, as I had said earlier, he owned a Submariner and decided to sell it. His main reason was he didn't like the fit on the wrist. He felt like it was too thick and the case back made the ride uncomfortably high on his wrist, I think is what he said. The lug profile on the super maxi case or super case of the Submariner just didn't end up appealing to him. He wanted to see some kind of close-up looks at how these watches compare in those terms and kind of on the wrist terms. I will preface all of this by saying that I have no problem with the way the Submariner feels on the wrist. I feel like it's one of my most comfortable watches and I love wearing it. So I don't suffer from the problems that he had, but, I understand where he's coming from. I had issues with the Rolex Explorer 39mm on the wrist. It just was never comfortable for me. And lots of people have commented that the Explorer is one of their most comfortable favorite watches. So I get it. I understand where he's coming from. Just because I think that the Submariner is perfect and comfortable on my wrist doesn't mean that everybody is going to. Let's zoom in and take a look at the lug profiles on both of these watches, because there is a difference. Both of these watches are considered to have super cases or maxi cases. People use the term interchangeably, but I think the appropriate term is super case. However, you can see that from the top-down view, the lug profile of the Submariner is a little bit stockier, a little bit bulkier, a little bit wider at the shoulder. It's not significant though, even zoomed in this closely. You don't see a huge difference. I'll say that on the wrist, it is, when you look down at the watch, I think a little bit noticeable. I think you do kind of feel like the watch is a little slimmer and trimmer. Again, it could be just a psychological thing. Maybe I'm imagining it, because looking at it here, even zoomed in like this, very little difference. It's kind of surprising, actually. Yeah, again, the GMT does have a more slender lug profile, but not by a large margin. Also, the crown guards are a little bit smaller on the GMT. Not like this is really something that you're gonna notice in terms of fit on the wrist or anything, but I did want to put them side by side. The lugs on the Submariner are just a little bit wider overall. There's more material there. What about the side profiles on these two watches, the mid case and the case backs in particular? Well, if we look at it dead on, the mid case doesn't seem to be much thinner, if at all. The profile doesn't seem to be much different, if at all, than the Submariner. Of course, the Submariner is on the right, if you're not sure. But the case back is significantly different. We can see that on the Submariner, the case back bulges down and out significantly more. I wouldn't call the case back on the GMT on the left perfectly flat, but significantly lower profile, and I find that that is the most noticeable difference when it's on the wrist. Probably after the Jubilee bracelet, feeling quite a bit more comfortable and very nicely draped on the wrist as compared to the Oyster. But yeah, that's your big differences in the overall profiles of the cases of a Submariner and a GMT Master II, in particular the Pepsi. If you were trying to decide between a Submariner and a GMT, in particular the Pepsi, like you wanted one but you couldn't get both, another big consideration, like I'd mentioned, is going to be the bracelet. And the clasps are significantly different as well. The Submariner clasp does, of course, have glide lock, and glide lock is an amazing, beautiful thing. I absolutely love it. Whereas this is just a folding lock Oyster clasp with an easy link. I do not care for the easy link. I've said it numerous times in videos. 5mm is just way too much of an adjustment for any sort of loosening that I might need. The 2mm increments on the glide lock are significantly better. 2mm in or out always is just the right amount for my wrist. The 5mm in and out of the easy link is never the right amount. It's too tight or too loose. The big difference otherwise is going to be that the size, the glide lock clasp, is much bigger. I don't know why Rolex hasn't started doing glide lock clasps on all of their watches, but make it a smaller one. This one has 20mm of adjustability. They could do a small 10 or 12mm glide lock inside of this clasp and keep it relatively the same size as the clasp already is, I would suspect. I don't know why they're not doing that on all of their professional watches. They really ought to. There's no excuse. So here's something I wanted to touch on. I love the Submariner. I've said it many times. It's my favorite watch that I own. But now that I've had some time with the Pepsi, I'm kind of wondering, would I rather have a Pepsi? If I could only have one of these watches, what would I pick? And I'll tell you what, I'm sort of leaning towards the Pepsi. There's something about it when I'm wearing it. The feel on the wrist, the red and the blue bezel, something about it. It just really super connects with me. I might consider, if I had to pick just one, saying that I would pick the Pepsi. I'm not sure. In a perfect world, I would own both of these watches and I would rotate them every week or so. I'd wear this one for a week, this one for a week. That would be the perfect world for me, if I could make that happen. Maybe someday I will. Maybe the availability of these watches will become more reasonable. Maybe my AD will just call me up one day and tell me he's got one and I can have it. Who knows? But yeah, it would be difficult for me to just nail it down and say which is my favorite. It's not a close call. I love the Submariner. I've said it over and over again in video after video. But there's something very magical for me about the Pepsi. What about that Batman, though? Why am I neglecting it? Well, I wouldn't say I'm neglecting it. I'm just a little bit enamored with the Pepsi. I do, again, like the Batman, but if I had, these three watches sitting in front of me and I had to choose one or two, like the Batman would get eliminated. It wouldn't be a factor for me. I know people are going to be upset about that. They're going to argue with me in the comments. Hey, if that's the one you like, that's awesome. Like, these are just personal opinions. This entire video is mostly just my opinions. There's very little facts. Some people do value my thoughts and opinions, so I wanted to share them with everybody. And yeah, that's where we're at right now. So the Batman it would never be a watch that I would own personally. I can appreciate that it's a great watch. I do like it, you know, like as a piece of art to behold. I think it's a cool watch for sure. It's just never going to be a part of my collection. All right, guys, that was my presentation and comparison of the GMT Master II Pepsi versus Batman. Also threw in a little bit of Submariner so that you could see the differences between that watch. That's for Chris. He asked me specifically to do that because he didn't end up loving his Submariner, and he was thinking about getting a GMT Master II instead. Hopefully those pictures and video were enough of, I don't know, an indication as to whether or not you want to still pursue that line of thinking. So, what do I think about these watches? Well, I probably made it abundantly clear that I absolutely love the BLRO, the Pepsi, on the Jubilee bracelet. I am just dying to own this watch. After having had access to it now for a couple of days, it makes me want it even more. I guess, you know, they have this saying, like, don't meet your heroes or something. You know, the watch isn't my hero, of course, but in that vein, I guess, you know, it's a watch that I wanted, and unfortunately having this opportunity to meet it, it just makes me want it even more. As far as the Batman is concerned, not as impressed with it. I mean, it is an impressive watch, don't get me wrong, but I don't get that yearning feeling to own one or to have one. And really, what it comes down to, you know, it's just bezel color and bracelet, that's it, right? I mean, they're very similar, basically identical watches besides those two things. And just, you know, something about the Pepsi bezel and that Jubilee bracelet does it for me. Maybe it's because I have the Submariner on an oyster bracelet, and I like that oyster bracelet even better than the BLNR's bracelet, and just a little bit of blue on the bezel is feel like what I'd be buying if I went with the Batman. Whereas with the Pepsi, I feel like I'm getting a little bit more of a distinctly different watch, and it would complement a collection that has a Submariner in it better, in my opinion. I had touched on during the tabletop portion of this video that whole availability or shortage scare, or you know, whatever you want to call it, and I think it's a little bit of a hoax. I mean, like I had told you, the store Exquisite Timepieces, when I was picking this watch up from them, they said that they see these BLRO watches all the time. Routinely, people are bringing them in to sell them. I think that dealers are getting plenty of them. The problem is that the supply is not meeting the demand. And the demand is based of people like me that want to own the watch and people like flippers that want to just sell the watch. It's a little bit frustrating because there's enough people like me that want to buy it, and there's not enough watches to give them to me, or to us, I guess I should say. The flippers are getting in there and you know, mucking up the whole thing basically. But there's not like a few of these watches. Like, people always say, oh, I went to my authorized dealer and they told me they've only got one. I'm going to be honest, I think they're lying to you. If an authorized dealer after a year has said, oh, we've only gotten one BLRO Pepsi, I don't believe it. I don't believe it anymore. How could my you know, pre-owned dealer be seeing them on a weekly basis if all of these authorized dealers are only getting one a year? The math just doesn't seem to work. And I mean, it's just napkin math. It's not like I did any actual numbers on a whiteboard or anything, but the math doesn't seem to work in my mind. If people are buying them and flipping them at the rate that they are, they're coming from somewhere, you know? It's frustrating. And that's just what we have to deal with, I guess. What are you going to do? Alright guys, I guess that's going to wrap this one up for today. I hope you enjoyed checking out these two watches with me and just doing a little bit of a fun side-by-side comparison. I really enjoyed checking them out and sharing them with you guys. So, as always, I'd like to say thank you for tuning in and watching. I appreciate it. And if you'd like to help support my channel, there's a number of ways that you can do that. I always list them down in the description of every video I do. Number one, my social media. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. I would appreciate that very much. It does help the channel grow and get more recognition. So do that if it's not too much of a problem. Number two, Patreon support. I have a few guys over on Patreon helping me out. If you're not familiar, Patreon's a website where you can go and you can just donate a couple bucks a month to me, whatever you're comfortable with. That money does help me do things on the channel. I get watches on loan and I have to do return shipping. That is, as you might be aware, expensive, especially when you factor in all of the insurance that I have to put on all the watches that I'm returning. So a little bit of Patreon support would be awesome. If you can swing it, that would be great. Finally, I also have a link to Amazon down there. It's through my affiliate account. If you want to do any shopping on Amazon, if you're thinking about buying something that I've reviewed, or buying anything for that matter, you click on my affiliate link first and then do your shopping, and I get a commission. Those commissions do add up. Big thanks to everybody that has been using my Amazon affiliate link. I really do appreciate it. Well, that's everything I got for you today, so until the next one, I'll go ahead and say bye now.